Dr. Stanton, if you're ready.
I am.
Thank you very much.
So I just speak here.
Yeah, please.
Hi.
You need your.
It's my honor to be able to speak to you. We've just been at a demonstration, and the demonstration has had quite a few people, at least 500 people. Yes, thank you. And we're we're speaking because this is a genocide. There's no question that it is a genocide that needs to be recognized by the United Nations, by the rest of the world. Uh, it has gone on since the 1890s, in fact, against the Hazara. And over, well, how many hundreds of thousands of Hazaras have died, actually, up to this point? Uh, right now, the Taliban are failing to prevent the genocide against the Hazaras, and in fact, they're even participating in it. So it's nothing new, really. It's just that the world doesn't recognize it yet, and they need to. They need to recognize it. What we want to do is take this to the UN Human Rights Council and ask the High Commissioner for Human Rights to appoint a independent investigative team to investigate this genocide. They can do this even if they can't get into Afghanistan. They can do it with all of the people who are in other countries now who have witnessed this. In other words, that is how the uh, investigative team did its investigation for Myanmar. And it was a very powerful investigation. It came out with a report that was 444 pages long, that was so well documented that it resulted in Gambia taking a case against Myanmar in the International Court of Justice for genocide. That is what we need here. We need a investigation team to prove that this is genocide. I know it is genocide because I've studied genocide for 40 years, and this is a clear case. It is the intentional destruction, in whole or in part, of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And this is a ethnic and religious group that is being partially destroyed, significantly part of the Hazara group. And it is being destroyed right now in front of our eyes. And yet the world needs to acknowledge it now, needs to recognize it. So that's what our hope is. And what
Uh,
we hope then can be done is, it will increase assistance to the Hazaras. Hopefully, it will scare the Taliban into stopping it. That's what we hope. So sometimes these things can actually have an impact that takes effect, even if the regime doesn't really want to hear the truth. So that's what we want to get to them. We want to get the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dr. Stanton. Just here is some question. So first of all, how long it will take this process approximately until the moment that we will have this opportunity to get this recognition or recognition of Hazara genocide?
Well, in the case of Myanmar, it took about 2 years after the genocide by the Myanmar government, the army there, against the Rohingya people. Uh, that occurred, it was actually occurring as early as 2012, but it wasn't really recognized as a genocide until 2017. And the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights appointed an investigative team. It took them 2 years to come out with a report. And that report is probably a good example of what it would take in this case, too. It'd probably take 2 years or so.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Stanton, and welcome. My question is how can you help the Hazara people inside Afghanistan in this situation? Because the Taliban and the system do not allow support.
Well, there is a very important way we can help, and that is we must insist with the Taliban that any assistance from UNICEF, from the World Food Program, and other assistance programs through the UN go to the Hazara as well as to the rest of the Afghan people. In other words, we have to make sure the UN is really getting assistance to the Hazara, and that means directly to the Hazara. If the Taliban try to block it, then the UN needs to really come down hard on the Taliban and say, look, if you're not going to assist the Hazaras, then we're going to stop all assistance to Afghanistan. I don't expect that to be the result. I would expect them to say, okay, we'll do it. Uh, but it is a hard process. Here you have a tyrannical government in charge of Afghanistan, and they, of course, are they're the route by which the UN will try to get the aid in to people in Afghanistan now, and that is a big problem because the Taliban will try to block aid to the Hazaras. The UN must not accept that. The UN must tell the Taliban that is unacceptable and that only aid that goes to everybody will get through.
Exactly, and also the another and very important question is this: as we all of us know, as one of the largest ethnic groups in Afghanistan, Hazaras have been endured various forms of oppressions, form of governmental rulers and governments, including slavery, systematic expulsion from ancestral homes and lands, and massacres. Uh, these all experience, I think, lead some to consider Hazaras to be one of the most persecuted people in the world. But I think UN and United Nations generally, international community, has the obligation and they must to pressure the Taliban to protect a Hazara community, and this genocide against them will not take place anymore. How United Nations take action, how they can actually are they able to do that?
Well, I think so. A good example is the Myanmar case, which I said, first of all, you have to prove it, and that's why you get an investigative team in to show that it's genocide. But you can also then work through uh, the resolutions process in the General Assembly. That's the best place to go for this because the Security Council, I think, probably is unlikely. I think that China and Russia will probably veto any resolutions that are taken to the Security Council about it. Uh, that is, nevertheless, I think that actually the Security Council could be helpful in one aspect, and that is that China and Russia have not vetoed any resolutions to continue the UN mission there and to continue UN assistance to the Afghan people. So that is we need to use that. We need to use the fact that the UN does have agencies like World Food Program, like UNICEF and others that can bring aid into the Afghan people, and including the Taliban. So that is that's one avenue that's in New York. The avenue that's in Geneva is the UN Human Rights Council, and I believe we need to bring this onto the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council, and that can be done by any government that is a member of the council. So, for example, Norway or the other governments that are part of the UN Human Rights Council can bring this up, and they can get it uh, put as a special concern of the UN Human Rights Council. They can appoint a special rapporteur, which they already have, in fact. So these are the ways that you get the news out. Now, in terms of actually changing the situation, frankly, the UN has very little power to do that because the UN doesn't have an army, and all it can use is moral persuasion. Uh, However, what we can say, is that the UN is not powerless when it comes to that kind of persuasion. And I've seen it happen. I mean, in Cambodia, for instance, uh, it we wanted a trial for the Khmer Rouge, and it took us years to get it, but eventually we got it. First, the Khmer Rouge had to be overthrown, which they were, by Vietnam, and then after that, it was possible to get a trial. In this case, I think that the overthrow of the Taliban is going to have to come from the Afghan people. I think that that's pretty clear now. And so it's going to require what I think. needs to be a really concerted campaign of nonviolent resistance to what the Taliban are doing. I say nonviolent resistance because, in my experience, it is the most effective way to overthrow a tyranny, a tyrannical regime. Violence usually just breeds more violence. In this case, I think that nonviolent resistance is the best approach.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Dr. Stanton. So, what you have explained, there is a very important question regarding the recognition of Hazara genocide. Will it be a problem? I mean, Russia and China in United Nations for recognition of Hazara genocide
It
in
will
the
only
future, maybe. Yeah, yeah.
it will only be a problem in the Security Council. In the General Assembly, I think you'll be able to get it. Uh, in the Human Rights Council, I think you'll be able to get it. So I think there are these other ways to do it in the UN system. Uh, I, you have to use each of these parts of the UN with political consciousness about how they work. And in the case of, unfortunately, in the UN Security Council, these five great powers have vetoes. I would like to do away with the vetoes myself, but that isn't going to happen. So we still have to face that. Uh, in the General Assembly, there are no vetoes. So you can see what's happening right now, for instance, on Ukraine. Uh, there is a procedure called the Uniting for Peace resolution, which is being used on the Ukraine issue, in which the General Assembly uh, can, in fact, have the power to authorize use of force. And that is a case like what we have in Afghanistan. I don't think that this is a situation, though, where use of force is going to be very helpful. I think it's going to have to be an overthrow of the Taliban government through nonviolent means. And I think that can happen. It's happened many times now. We've seen it again and again in the governments of the world. I think it will happen again in Afghanistan.
Uh, Thank you, Mr. Daryobi. You can ask your questions, and thanks to Mr. Stanton for taking the time.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, as we know that you have a lot of experience regarding this kind of situation, and then especially as you mentioned you about the Myanmar and the Vietnam, and those things is very important. So so far, our colleague the already we have some documents, and then we provided some documentary regarding to the Hazara genocide, and which is important for us. I'm pretty sure that it's going to be important for the international law court. So my question is here. Uh, can we have some of your advice that could help us? Because as I know, so Hazara people, we don't have that much power in, for example, in the UN, and then we don't have that much power in the politics. So how? What is your suggestion? What is the solution? The best solution for us to approach this power, for example, the UN and then United Nations, also the US and security and all of this.
What we saw today with demonstrations around the world is a very good first step because it makes it clear to many governments around the world what a terrible problem this is. Uh, Instead of just ignoring it, they can't ignore it if we keep the pressure on, if we keep demonstrations happening around the world. So that's a very important first step. We also need to have, I think, a organized effort to influence policymakers in key countries in the world. Uh, that's a diplomatic effort. And what you need to do, of course, in that is you need to get certain countries that are specifically interested in this problem. I would think the US would be, for instance. I also think the Netherlands would be. I think that the UK would be. I think Canada would be. So I think there are a number of countries who are UN members that you could get to advocate for you. And here it is a huge help that there are now a lot of Hazaras living in these countries. Uh, you can literally go and meet with the diplomats and with the policymakers in these countries. And Hazaras should not be bashful or timid about going to meet with diplomats, just ordinary Hazaras. You should ask for a meeting and say, look, we've got a real problem here in our country, and we'd like you to pay attention to it. And the way you do that is you find out who in the Foreign Affairs Department of the country that you're in, Canada or the United States or UK or Norway or wherever, and you find out who it is in charge of the policy on Afghanistan, and you ask for a meeting. And so you go in and meet with them. And that in turn then can get that person involved and have that person take your side inside that government. And that in turn can then influence the UN because the UN is made up of its nation states. And so to get to the UN, you really need to go through these governments. There is one other place in the UN which I was involved in creating actually, and that is the Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. That's in New York, and they would be directly interested in this problem. So asking for a meeting with the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide uh, would be a very good thing to do. And I strongly advise you and advise Hazara people to do that. And I can tell you here, in the U.S. at least, Genocide Watch would be very helpful to you in arranging for such a meeting. We know her, and we think she will be very concerned about the genocide of the Hazaras. So that is another important way to make this problem go to all the way up to the Secretary General, because the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide reports directly to the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Mr.
Dr.
Stanton. If you have time, we have some people. For example, there were Mr. Arif can have a question. Go ahead, Mr. Arif.
Thank you, Ms. Sima, and thank you, Ms. Dr. Stanton. I really appreciate your advocacy for the Hazara people and that you speak up against the Hazara genocide. So, you did a very good analysis about the Hazara genocide and the things that we should do. But there is one thing that I want to ask you, and that is that, of course, the recognition of the Hazara genocide takes a lot of time, and it is a very long process. And there are also, like as you said, that there are a lot of barriers. But there is one thing during the time, during the process, that until the Hazara genocide gets a recognition, and then the UN takes pragmatic action. There's also another concept or principle which is called the R2P, or responsibility to protect. So now, responsibility to protect, which has three pillars. And the first pillar is that every state a state is responsible to protect their citizens from those from the four crimes, which are crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and mass atrocities. And right now in Afghanistan, Taliban being the de facto power in Afghanistan, they not only protect the Hazaras from genocide and war and other and atrocities, mass atrocities. In fact, they are themselves involved in the Hazara genocide. As a good example of that, that we all know that they committed a genocide against the Hazaras during 1998 in Mazar Sharif, killing more than tens of thousands of Hazaras. So, and also over the course of 20 years, that we have seen that they have deliberately and systematically attacked Hazaras, and they have killed many Hazaras. So now the question which I have is that how can the principle of responsibility to protect can be used and can be activated so that the UN should use this.
You're talking about the responsibility to protect, and that is a very good point to raise. Um, The only problem with the responsibility to protect is that it has never been made into international law. The Genocide Convention is international law, and so is the crimes against humanity. So are war crimes. They are under law. In other words, if you violate one of those uh, treaties, uh, you can actually have a case brought to the International Court of Justice, or you can have it at the International Criminal Court, or in other courts. The unfortunate thing about the responsibility to protect, even though it's a very good idea and a very good principle, and it was in fact endorsed in 2005 by the UN General Assembly, there's no enforcement mechanism. Uh, and there's also no court under which you can enforce it. Uh, so it's a very good idea, in other words, and it has been advocated in in several situations at least. But um, I don't think that very many governments today consider it a binding obligation. Uh, that's the real problem with the responsibility to protect. However, there is a special advisor on the responsibility to protect also to the UN Secretary General. And that person, who is also in New York, could be appealed to about this Hazara genocide. Because I agree with you. When a government is persecuting and committing crimes against humanity and genocide against its own citizens, that is exactly when the responsibility to protect should be invoked. Whether you can get a government that has armed forces or any other way of doing something about it, uh, if you can get them to act, that is a hard problem. I know from experience in the State Department that the State Department lawyers do not consider the responsibility to protect to be a binding legal obligation. They do not think it has the same status, for instance, as the Genocide Convention or the Rome Treaty or of the ICC or of war crimes law under the Geneva Conventions. So it's a. I think it's actually a very good principle. You know, responsibility to protect finally put national sovereignty right side up. National sovereignty had been for centuries upside down, in which people thought that the sovereign was the king, and that sovereignty went down from the king down to the people. The responsibility to protect turned it right side up again and said, no, sovereignty comes from the people. The only legitimacy for government is from the people. So when a government violates the rights of the people, it loses its legitimacy. And that's when other countries then should intervene in that country and try to change the situation. What we've seen, though, is whenever R2P is invoked, and it was invoked, for instance, in Libya, uh, it can be a big problem because unless whoever intervenes has a long term commitment to rebuild the country, uh, it can actually be worse than no intervention at all. Uh, we've seen that in many countries, actually. Uh, I could argue, for instance, that the you know our failure to intervene in Rwanda is an example of the failure of uh, our responsibility to intervene in a country that was undergoing genocide. That was before the R2P doctrine was put into effect in 2005. I think in some ways the R2P doctrine was a result of realization that when there is genocide, the rest of the world has a duty to intervene. It's just that it hasn't really been enforced yet.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. We have Miss Stardust with us here. She has a question too. Go ahead, Mr. Stardust. Your turn.
Mrs. Stardust, if you have our voice, you can go ahead, please.
By the way, I think this is amazing that I can speak to 500 people through
Hello.
Oh
Twitter.
yes.
I'm so sorry.
Absolutely amazing.
Could you? I could not hear you before. I'm sorry, dear. I heard you called on me. Should I? Can I ask?
Yeah.
Yes. Please go
Yes,
ahead.
Dr. Stanton, thank you so much for being here with us. This is so important. I want to ask you about a very short term problem. I'm hoping that maybe you can give us some advice. You mentioned about going to the World Food Program for food, etc., making connections with them. And a moment ago, you just said something about a situation that might not be an enforceable situation. But my concern is we have Hazaras that are being discriminated against at the local level with the World Food Program. We
That's right.
they're starving, and we have advocates like myself are scrambling to get food to families. It's every day. It's 24/7. But the Hazaras are being discriminated against now for food, and not only that, the World Food Program is also at times, while it albeit it may not be intentionally, they're also handing out rotten food. I had 5 families tell me last week the food that they were given, these were not Hazara families, the Hazara families couldn't get food, but they told me the food that they received was rotten. Do you have someone at the World Food Program you can recommend that we can talk to about this food situation directly up with the WFP?
I don't have a specific person myself. I left the State Department, in 1999, so I don't have that person. But what I do have is connections here in our own State Department who could tell us who the people in the World Food Program are, to whom we need to address ourselves about this discrimination, about this failure to get food to the people who need it, that namely the Hazaras and other people. Uh, I'm not surprised by this because the World Food Program uh, is often subject to restrictions put on them by the national governments. And I'm sure that's happening in Afghanistan. I'm sure the Taliban are keeping some of this food from ever getting to people that they discriminate against, namely the Hazaras. Uh, I've seen
Yes,
it also.
absolutely. Yeah,
I've
that
seen
is
it in,
absolutely correct because, in fact, for the longest time, in order for anyone to get food from the WFP, they had to register with the district elders. And at times, the Taliban were demanding that the district elders get all the information, the ethnicity, the names, the phone numbers, their addresses of anybody that tried to register for food. So, yes, you're absolutely right. They're being restricted from getting food, or they're being killed if they try to get it. Many of my families told me they would rather starve to death than try to go get food with the WFP because they know their name would be turned over to the Taliban.
and I understand that too. And I've seen it before. It happened in Iraq as well,
Right.
where Christians, for instance, up on the Nineveh Plain, who needed food, who needed to resettle and so forth, were being discriminated against because the Iraqi government, frankly, did not want to help the Christians on on the Nineveh Plain. Uh, so I know you're right. UN is, after all, subject to the kinds of political pressures uh, because it has to distribute with the approval of the government of the country that it is working in, and
Of
that is a
course.
terrible problem. Uh,
Yes.
in fact, I think there are ways, however, to deal with that a little bit. Uh,
Well,
using
I don't want to dominate the time here because your
It's
time
okay.
with us is so precious. So I don't want to take up any more time, and there's more people that want to ask questions. But I see you're talking through Kevin's um, phone. If there's maybe a way that I can get in touch with you or someone at your office later, so that I can get a hold of the WFP and talk to them about this.
I'd be happy to do that, of course.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for both. We have Miss Mahdia here. She has a question too. Your turn, Mahdia.
Mrs. Najwa, if you can hear Mahdi and Najwa, please go
Hello
ahead.
to everyone. I listened to the instances words. I have a question that What's the reason for USA silence? And you know that Afghanistan is the only place to be injected into the White House's mind. But any USA media cannot broadcast the protests and gatherings of people for stopping Hazara genocide.
Well, you're asking why the U.S. has been silent about this. Uh, I am not surprised because I think, frankly, the U.S. is ashamed of what happened in Afghanistan. We failed in Afghanistan. We tried for 20 years to, prevent the Taliban from taking over the country again, and frankly, we failed. And I think a lot of Americans are especially embarrassed and ashamed of how we left. I've seen it before again. I saw it in Vietnam and Cambodia, where we also failed. And we also left in a very, very, uh, well, I think disreputable and a unacceptable way, where we did not make enough plans, where we did not allow enough people to escape from this tyranny that was coming. Uh, and so the result in Cambodia, 2 million people died under the Khmer Rouge. Uh, I once voted for George McGovern, who, was a Democratic candidate against the war in Vietnam. But it was George McGovern who called on the U.S. to then intervene after the Khmer Rouge took over and he saw what was happening, namely genocide. Uh, but he couldn't, he couldn't convince anybody in the U.S. government that we should go back in. I think the same kind of dynamic is happening here. The U.S. has failed in Afghanistan, uh, and it really doesn't want to have to deal with the results. It doesn't want to have to face the consequences. And the consequences are death. Death for many people, starvation, discrimination, genocide. That's exactly what happened in Cambodia. And I don't think we should let another Cambodia happen. We need to take a much more activist role here in the United States. But my explanation for our failure to do that so far is I think the U.S. government is ashamed of what happened.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stanton. Also, we have some other speakers that they might have some question. Mr. Husseini, welcome. And if you have any question, please go ahead.
Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
do.
Yes, please go ahead.
Uh, anyway, I think he has some
Do you
problem
hear
with
me
the
now?
connection.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, yes.
I just wanted to start with um, thanking Dr. Stanton for being with us at this campaign and this event. It's very important to have people who have worked on genocide understand our voice and hear it and also publicize it. I wanted to go ahead with a similar question that was raised earlier about the food security of the Hazaras. Um, and we here in the United States, in Texas and other states, have been working to tackle that issue, especially after the uh, withdrawal of Americans. There was a huge food crisis in all of the country and in Kabul, and unemployment. So what we decided was channeling some of our funds towards creating some bakeries. And so far, we had three bakeries. We couldn't continue with three of them because of funding. One is still functioning. And so far, we have distributed about 1.5 million pieces of bread for free
Wonderful.
for the people who are in need. We do surveys. Surveys are going to be updated every couple of months. So those families who are actually in need in the west of Kabul are receiving some support from us. What I'm wondering was, and we have been working on this for a long time, the World Food Program, the United Nations, the United States of America. they're sending money for support, humanitarian support, to Afghanistan, and the way it's being distributed is being very controversial. And we were wondering if there were ways that the actual Hazara nonprofits who are working on the ground, who have the infrastructure, who have the know-how, who knows the people on the ground, how much of cooperation between these international organizations, including and particular WFP, with our nonprofits is possible? How much of that cooperation is possible? Who to contact? How to get in touch to increase both awareness about the food discrimination and also provide some relief to the people on the ground? Thanks.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful question, and it's wonderful what you're doing uh, to actually build bakeries and to get bread to the people. I can't think of a more wonderful expression of the kind of love that we need in this circumstance. Uh, I'm a Christian, and remember that it was Jesus who used bread and wine as his way of expressing his love for his disciples. And well, there's also a Hebrew saying that I think is very applicable here. If you save one life, you save the world, and that is what you're doing. So, getting that money that you need to, build this kind of relief, this humanitarian assistance. Uh, the best way in this country, at least, is there's two ways. One is through USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. It is distributing all of its assistance that goes into Afghanistan through NGOs, basically, and that is so. It's looking for NGOs that are actually doing, work in Afghanistan. Uh, I know personally because my wife worked for USAID for 34 years, and they worked through a lot of NGOs in Afghanistan, setting up maternity clinics, maternal survival programs, all kinds of assistance. Uh, I was very dismayed when we basically cut Afghanistan completely off when we left. Uh, I'm glad we're back to using NGOs and the UN as a way to get assistance to the Afghan people. Because the Afghan people shouldn't be blamed for what the Taliban are doing. They shouldn't suffer because of it. Uh, we need to get the assistance to them, directly to them. And it's really good, at least, that the UN hasn't pulled out, and also that uh, NGOs like yours haven't pulled out. You haven't given up. I was in a situation like that myself. After the Khmer Rouge were overthrown in Cambodia, I was asked to go in Cambodia in 1980 for Church World Service and CARE and some of the other American agencies to set up a relief program there. And the critics of it said, how can you possibly do that when you know that a communist government is still in charge of Cambodia? Uh, it's not the Khmer Rouge, but it's backed by Vietnam and the Soviet Union. And my answer was, the Cambodian people shouldn't be punished for their government. Let us make sure that they have what they need to grow food and to, have an agricultural system that works, and schools that can educate people how to read, little kids. The Khmer Rouge had literally shut down all the schools for 3 years. I mean, that is the situation we're facing again in Afghanistan. We shouldn't cut off the people in Afghanistan. We've got to find ways to get food and all kinds of other assistance to them. So I thank you for what you're doing. And I ask you then to look for ways also through private contributions to get the funds you need to continue your marvelous work.
I think
Thank you very much,
yes.
Dr. Stanton. Thank you for being here. And also, if there is anyone have any question, you guys can raise your hand. Or otherwise, if you have any question, Mrs. Nuri or Mr. Khalakir, you can go ahead.
I think there were two persons whose questions, Mr. Daryobi and Hassan. Hassan, go ahead. Your turn.
First one, thank you, Mr. Stanton, to time with us. And my question is, Mr. Stanton, what you can, as a person, as a human, and then as a professor in a university in the United States, what you can
Do you want to
promise the
translate?
Hazara people as your job, your humanity job, what you can promise a group of people who has been killed during history, what you can, as you as human, as a professor, what can you promise and how you can help us?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Um, my special expertise is about the law of genocide. So there are two things I can do. One is I can help get this case brought before the UN Human Rights Council. I can ask the Human Rights, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I can ask the Human Rights Commissioner to declare this to be, a situation that needs an independent investigative team to look at what's happening to the Hazara in Afghanistan and write a really definitive report about what's happening. That is one thing I can do. Uh, and I also can go to our people here in the State Department and ask them to give this real serious consideration. The second thing I can do is we need to start a pressure campaign here in Washington, in the U.S., about the Hazara genocide. So we're going to convene what we're going to call the Genocide Working Group to really take this seriously and put pressure on Congress, on our State Department, on the National Security Council to take action to try to stop this genocide. We did it before. Uh, when ISIS was committing genocide in Iraq, we organized the Genocide Working Group, and we got Congress to pass a, a law that declared that ISIS was committing genocide in Iraq. And that in turn got the State Department to go ahead and say the same thing, which increased the pressure for us to uh, increase our military action against ISIS and finally defeat them. Of course, they're still out there, but I say we defeated them at least in part. Uh, so that is an example of what can be done here in the U.S. And that in turn, of course, resulted in a lot more aid to resettle people and so forth. So that's one thing. Uh, we can also take this to the UN General Assembly and to possibly even the Security Council. When I was in the State Department, I wrote 37 UN Security Council resolutions on Africa that passed, most of them unanimously. Uh, because we frankly did it right. We got them agreed upon within the Security Council by all the countries that were part of it, even Russia. That was the day when those were the days before Putin had taken over. But that is the sort of thing you can do in the Security Council. But also, there's the General Assembly. We can do that too. Because I am a specialist on the law of genocide, those are my special abilities, I'd say, to be able to do that. And of course, each of us has his or her own way that they can respond to this.
Thank you for your efforts, Sir Stanton. Next turn is Mr. Daryobi. Go ahead.
Uh, Doctor, I really appreciate your time, and honestly, you just give the answer. That's what I was trying to ask you. So we will ask our team to keep contact with you, and we will definitely need your beautiful idea and your suggestions since you're working with UN and you have experience in this part. So we definitely need your advice and your suggestions on that part. So if you don't mind, we will ask Khalid here to keep contact with you, and then other our colleagues, so that we can speak and we can go ahead. Thank you, Mister.
Thank
Uh,
you, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak to so many people who are, really concerned about this genocide against the Hazaras. Uh, I think it's probably time for us to end this interview right now because, frankly, it's getting cold out here in the park now. The sun is getting a little lower in the sky, so I think I better put my sweater on and probably head home. So, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very
thank you.
much, Dr. Staton. Sorry, just for the last 2 minutes, I think. What's your main point or last message for Hazara community or generally Afghanistan people?
I think my last point is never give up. Never, ever give up. Never lose hope. Because hope is the assurance that life will triumph over death. And that is the assurance that we need here. We must
Thank you very
always remember that.
much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you very much.
You're most
Thank you for
welcome.
being here. We're grateful for your support. What we promise you that we will pass and whisper, we will acknowledge your support into our future generations, from generations to generations until this world exists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
Grateful for your support. All right, guys. Thank you. Thank you.